It was just after 8:15 on the evening of February 19th, 1994, when paramedics wheeled a woman through the doors of the emergency room at Riverside General Hospital in Southern California. Her name was Gloria Ramirez. She was 31 years old, a wife and a mother of two, and she was dying. That part, tragically, was not a mystery. Gloria had advanced, late-stage cervical cancer, and by that night her body was failing, her heart racing erratically, her breathing shallow and rapid, her blood pressure falling. The emergency room team did what emergency room teams do. They moved fast. They started working to stabilize her. And then something happened that no one in that room had ever seen before, that no one has ever fully explained since, and that would turn an ordinary medical emergency into one of the strangest documented mysteries in the history of American medicine. The people trying to save Gloria Ramirez began to collapse. This is Dark Diagnosis Files, and this is the story of the patient the world would come to call the Toxic Lady. When Gloria arrived, she was semi-conscious and barely responsive, taking shallow breaths, her heart beating too fast and too irregularly to pump blood effectively. The staff began standard emergency care, an IV line, medications to sedate her and try to stabilize her rhythm, and preparations to shock her heart back into order if it came to that. As they worked, they started noticing things, small things at first, things that didn't fit. Gloria's skin had an unusual oily sheen to it, a greasy shimmer that several staff members noticed as they worked around her body. Then there was a smell. Some described it as fruity, others as a sharp garlic-like odor coming from her mouth or her body. A respiratory therapist in the room later said the only thing that had initially struck her as unusual was Gloria's age. Most patients arriving in that condition were elderly, not 31. And then a nurse named Susan Kane drew a sample of Gloria's blood and noticed something genuinely wrong with it. The blood, witnesses said, smelled strange, almost ammonia-like, and floating in it were unusual particles, manila-colored crystals, small flecks that simply should not have been there. The nurse passed the syringe to a medical resident named Julie Gorchinski, who looked closely and saw the same bizarre crystals suspended in the blood. The doctor in charge of the emergency room that night, Humberto Ochoa, observed them too. Nobody had time to make sense of it, because at that moment, the nurse who had drawn the blood, Susan Kane, suddenly felt faint. She said her face was burning. She swayed on her feet. Someone shouted to catch her, and Dr. Ochoa lunged and caught her as she collapsed, easing her limp body to the floor. She was lifted onto a gurney and wheeled out of the trauma room. Then, the resident, Julie Gorchinski, began to feel it too. Lightheaded, nauseated, she stepped out of the room and sat down at a nurse's station, and moments later, before she could even answer someone asking if she was all right, she slumped to the floor, unconscious. She became the second staff member wheeled out of that trauma room on a gurney within minutes, and it kept happening. A third staff member fell ill, then more. People were fainting, vomiting, gasping for breath, feeling burning sensations on their skin, some experiencing muscle spasms and an inability to move their limbs. In total, 23 of the 37 emergency room staff on duty that night would experience at least one symptom. Some would recover within hours, others would not. The scene inside that trauma room, by the accounts of those who lived it, descended into something close to controlled panic. Staff who moments earlier had been calmly running a resuscitation were now dropping where they stood. Colleagues were trying to drag colleagues to safety while fighting their own dizziness and nausea. No one understood what was hurting them, which direction the danger was coming from, or whether simply staying in the room a moment longer would be the thing that put them on a gurney next. In an emergency room, a place built to be the one location where a medical crisis can always be contained, the crisis was now spreading to the very people trained to stop it. The emergency room chairman made the only call he could. He ordered the emergency room evacuated. Patients were wheeled out into the parking lot outside the hospital. A skeleton crew, some now donning protective gear, stayed with Gloria to continue trying to save her. But it was already too late for her. Roughly 35 to 40 minutes after she arrived, Gloria Ramirez was pronounced dead. Her death caused, the coroner would ultimately determine, by cardiac complications stemming from her advanced cancer and kidney failure. Her death, in the end, was medically explainable. What had happened to the staff around her was not. With staff still falling ill and no known cause, the hospital declared a hazardous materials emergency. A specially trained hazmat team was called in. They swept the emergency room, testing the air for toxic gases, searching for any chemical spill or contamination that could explain what was happening. They found nothing. No gas, no spill, No environmental toxin. Nothing in that room could account for nearly 24 trained medical professionals suddenly being struck down around a single patient. Gloria's body itself was now treated as a potential biohazard. It was sealed in layers of protective shrouds, placed inside a specially sealed aluminum casket, and moved to an isolated section of the morgue. When the time came to perform her autopsy, the pathologist did so wearing protective suits and respirators, working with extreme caution, treating the body of a 31-year-old cancer patient as though it might be a canister of something lethal. What followed was one of the most extensive forensic investigations of its kind. Medical detectives, toxicologists, and scientists from numerous local, state, and federal agencies threw themselves at the puzzle. The Riverside County Health Department appointed a 2-person scientific team to interview every staff member exposed that night, profiling them in extraordinary detail, even comparing what each person had or hadn't eaten for dinner, searching for any common thread. And the results only deepened the mystery. The survey found a strange pattern. The people who had developed the most severe symptoms tended to be those who had worked closest to Gloria within a couple of feet and who had handled her intravenous lines. That pointed towards something coming from her body or her blood. But other findings cut against the idea of a released toxic fume. For instance, those most affected tended to be women rather than men, and their blood tests afterward came back normal, which didn't match a straightforward mass poisoning. That inconsistency led some investigators, early on, to a controversial conclusion, that this was a case of mass hysteria, a psychological chain reaction in which the sight of a colleague fainting triggered stress symptoms in others. It's a real, documented phenomenon, but the staff who fell most seriously ill rejected that explanation completely, and with good reason. It's worth pausing on how loaded that mass hysteria label was, and how quickly it was reached. For an emergency room staffed by trained professionals, people who spend their careers keeping their composure amid blood, trauma, and death, to be told that they had essentially panicked themselves into the intensive care unit was, to many of them, deeply insulting. These were not people prone to fainting at the sight of something unusual. They had seen everything, and the speed with which some officials reached for a psychological explanation, rather than continuing to search for a physical one, struck many of the affected workers as a way of quietly closing an embarrassing, unsolvable case, rather than actually solving it. Consider Julie Gorkinski, the resident who collapsed at the nurse's station. She did not simply faint and recover. After the exposure, she spent 2 weeks in the intensive care unit. She developed hepatitis. She developed a condition called avascular necrosis, a serious, lasting deterioration of the bone in her knees. These are not the symptoms of momentary panic. These are the marks of genuine physical harm. Gorkinski insisted firmly that whatever happened to her that night was chemical and real, not psychological, and it's very hard to look at 2 weeks in intensive care and lasting bone damage and call it hysteria. Other affected staff reported lingering effects of their own, tremors, muscle spasms, breathing problems, and memory lapses that persisted well beyond the night itself. Whatever moved through that room did not simply frighten people. For some of them, it left a lasting physical mark on their bodies that no amount of psychological explanation could account for. So, if it was real, and for at least some of the staff, it clearly was, then what actually happened? The most scientifically developed theory came from the Lawrence Livermore National Laboratory, whose researchers were brought in by the coroner's office to investigate. And what they proposed is a genuinely extraordinary chain of chemical events. It begins with a common substance called DMSO, dimethyl sulfoxide. DMSO is a solvent, available at the time in gel form, sometimes used as a home remedy for pain, rubbed onto the skin. Notably, people who use DMSO often report a garlic-like taste or odor, which could explain both the greasy sheen on Gloria's skin and the strange garlic smell the staff noticed. The theory goes like this. Gloria may have been using DMSO to manage her pain. Because of her kidney failure, her body couldn't clear substances normally, so the DMSO built up in her system. When the medical staff gave her oxygen, that oxygen may have reacted with the DMSO in her body to form a new compound, DMSO2, which is known to crystallize at room temperature. That could explain the manila crystals the staff saw floating in her blood. And then the final critical step. When the nurse drew Gloria's blood into a sealed vacuum tube, The researchers theorized that the unusual conditions caused that DMSO2 to convert one step further into dimethyl sulfate, or DMS. And dimethyl sulfate is not a home remedy. It is a genuinely dangerous, toxic compound, one capable of causing exactly the kind of symptoms the staff experienced when they were exposed to it in that enclosed trauma room. This theory, the transformation of a harmless pain remedy into a toxic gas through a rare chain of chemistry, was endorsed by the Riverside Coroner's Office and published in a forensic science journal. In essence, it suggested that a series of unlikely chemical reactions had briefly turned a dying woman's body into a source of poison gas. What makes the theory so compelling is how neatly it accounts for the specific, bizarre details that witnesses reported. The greasy sheen on her skin, explained by topical DMSO. The garlic odor, a known signature of DMSO in the body. The manila crystals in the blood, explained by DMSO2 crystallizing. And the sudden illness of the staff, explained by the final conversion to toxic dimethyl sulfate released as the blood was drawn and handled in the enclosed space. Each strange puzzle piece in this theory snaps into place. That elegance is exactly why the explanation became so widely cited. No universal scientific consensus was ever reached. The DMSO theory remains the best known and most detailed explanation, but it is a theory, not a settled fact. More than 30 years later, the case has never been definitively closed. No universal scientific consensus was ever reached. The DMSO theory remains the best known and most detailed explanation, but it is a theory, not a settled fact. More than 30 years later, the case has never been definitively closed, and that is what makes the story of Gloria Ramirez so haunting. It sits in a genuinely rare category, a real, thoroughly investigated, extensively documented event that still resists a final, certain answer. We know she died of her cancer. We know that around 24 trained professionals genuinely fell ill. We know at least one suffered severe, lasting physical harm, and we still cannot say, with complete certainty, exactly why. Gloria herself deserves to be remembered as more than a chilling nickname. She was a young mother, dying far too soon of a brutal disease, who spent the final minutes of her life at the center of a chaos she never chose and never understood. Her family fought hard against the toxic lady label, and it's worth honoring that. Whatever strange chemistry may have unfolded in that trauma room, it was not something she did. It was something that happened to her and around her in the last moments of a life already being taken by cancer. If unsolved cases like this one grip you the way they grip us, take a second to subscribe to Dark Diagnosis Files. We investigate the real, documented mysteries at the edges of medicine, the ones with answers, and the rare ones like this that may never have a certain answer at all. Your subscription is what lets us keep chasing them. This has been a real, documented case. Every detail in this video is sourced from confirmed records, forensic investigation, and peer-reviewed analysis. Dark Diagnosis Files investigates the horror that happens around hospitals and medicine. New cases every Sunday, Tuesday, and Friday. Real, documented, told with the gravity they deserve. 23 people fell ill in that emergency room, and the truth of what moved through the air that night may have died with the woman at the center of it.